Men are struggling in almost every way imaginable. Suicide, addiction, homelessness, a general sense of being lost in today's society, and they are often criticized. The purpose of this podcast is for men to understand their struggles and understand solutions. The man I'm joined by today is helping men with the big questions. Who am I and where am I going? He's been coaching and mentoring for the last 25 years and recently focused on coaching men. I'm joined today by Scott Holden so we can share solutions for men.
I am a professional certified coach and mentor, and I've been mentoring and coaching for probably, do the math in my head, 25 years at some level in some way. I just turned 56 this year, and it's just been a passion of mine for as long as I can remember. And probably 2020 is when it really became more than just something I did kind of on the side. It became my professional, whether we call it calling or direction or whatever. And coming out of the pandemic in March of 2020, got about 100 DMs, emails, texts, whatever, asking for direction, asking for coaching, asking for advice or whatever. And my wife and I sat down and said, this is probably a good opportunity for us to kind of formalize and really put some stuff into perspective on what we wanted to do. And that's what I do. That's what I coach. Do it, whether it's, premarital, helping you get ready for marriage. We do relationship coaching. And then about a year ago, I started working again in that space. I guess we'd call it men's coaching or whatever. So.
Okay. And does your wife coach with you?
Yeah, so we started our company. It's called Project Roots and Wings together, and she's kind of the corporate sphere, but we do a lot of our relationship coaching together. And then I'll do, I would probably say about 80% of our coaching in the relationship sphere is her and I, and then everything else is just me. So.
Okay. Yeah. And what were you doing before, Scott? Like before 2020, if you don't mind me asking?
No, that's great. I was working a couple hours a week, about 10 to 15 hours a week at a running shoe store. Grew up running and all of that. My wife's a runner as well. My mom always said, pick a cheap hobby, and running is not a cheap hobby. So worked at a running shoe store to kind of offset the cost of having to buy, 5 or 6 shoes. And then we have 2 boys, so I was doing that. But prior to that, my son just turned 11 this year, and I had made a choice. My wife and I had made a choice 12 years ago now, that I was going to be a stay-at-home kind of work from home dad. And so I just, would do that. And biggest blessing of my life was kind of that decision. So I just stayed at home, took care of the boys. We have 2 boys now. We had 1 at the time, and just did, coaching, personal training. I taught at, indoor cycling classes. And so anything around that kind of coaching sphere is what I've been doing with my life up until about 2020.
Okay. Very interesting. Maybe we'll circle back later on to being a stay-at-home dad.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting. But okay. How has the coaching with men been going? It sounds like you've been doing some variation of it for a long time, but how has it been going since you've started it?
Yeah, it's been going really great. Like I said, I started really the emphasis on, I think in the church sphere, we would call it discipleship, mentoring, kind of, I don't have any dog in the fight on what word you want to use for it and how you want to describe it. But that started back for me in the 1990s, early 1990s. I had been doing that, meeting with a couple guys here, a couple guys there. And I'd always had that kind of framework in place. And for me, it had always been about how do I help, and how am I engaged with this group of men or this man, and if it was an individual, to help them to create internal structures that would help them to live a life. And that's kind of the elevator pitch of our coaching business, is we want to help you to create a life that's thriving. And it was probably about a year ago at this time, actually, I got a phone call from a young gentleman in his early 30s, and he called and said, "Hey, I need some help. Got some stuff going on." And that was the beginning of my kind of re-entry into men's coaching. Up until that point, from early 2020 up until December of 2022, it had been predominantly, relationship coaching, whether it's premarital or we're just dating and we want to think about it, into marriage coaching as well. And then, like I said, December of 2022, got that phone call, and we've been doing it ever since. And for us, it's truly about helping you to create those internal structures that help you to create that life that's thriving. What does that look like for you? Because your life that's thriving for you is not a life that's thriving for me. And so we want to help you to recognize that and go from there. So.
Okay. And what would you say is the biggest struggle, I guess, with internal structures? Like what structures are usually missing, if there's a generalization, or what are some of the things that you've seen that are missing in terms of the internal structures for men?
Yeah. I think in my experience, whether it's as I look back into the early 1990s and my time throughout, and especially now, I have a degree in religion and philosophy, so I've been able to utilize that to really help me, dig in deeper. I would say, honestly, it's around identity is one of the primary things, and then vision. So we talk a lot about who you are, and who you're becoming. I think a lot of times we get so fixated on the past, and we think our past determines our future, and that's just simply not the case. We know, there's thousands of neurological studies. There's thousands of studies that would show us that, the past doesn't need to be, I should say. It can be if you choose to be, but it doesn't need to be a determinant of your future. Your past doesn't dictate your actions of today. You have a choice. And I think that's, for me, part of the identity piece is really showing you that you have agency. And it's not even me showing you, it's helping you to discover that you have agency, to discover that you have intrinsic worth and value and gifts and talents and all of those things. And that's kind of the identity piece. And then the vision piece is, how do we take the things that we're putting together here, the who am I and who am I becoming, that clear, vivid, distinct picture of who I want to be in 5, 10, 15 years, and then kind of reverse engineering it backwards to create a vision and a mission for how am I going to get there. I think there's just so much out there on, we see it. I think we see it all the time, that we think this is what it means to be a man, or this is what it means to be a man. And I think just the uncritical eye says, yeah, that sounds really great. But then when we get into it, we realize that, who did I become? I became something I didn't want to, whether that's, a millionaire, a billionaire, but I sacrificed my family. Well, it's because I didn't have an internal structure to show me that I didn't need these things. I wanted them and I can go after them, but I need to make sure that I'm creating an internal narrative and an internal structure that allows me to see that I am not this, but I am this. And so for me, it's identity and vision. And those two things, it's kind of right, the 1-2 punch for us. So
Right. Okay. And would you say that this is kind of that's very interesting. Would you say that men often struggle with like sort of with that identity piece of, you mentioned like values and like inherent I think it was talents, the words you used.
mhm.
Um would you say that men struggle with knowing their identity? Like knowing what their talents are, what their values are, like who they are, what they really want. Because I think that's really cool and beautiful, and we can talk more about like the vision part of it as well. But do you think men struggle with that, like understanding their own identity to begin with?
I do, and I don't think I'm a case study in that. I'm definitely not the high watermark there, but I think I've had, like I said, since the early '90s, I've had thousands of conversations. Um, and as I go back in my memory bank, as I go back through my journals, as I go back through my notes, even over the last year, maybe not 100% of the time, but close to 100% of the time, identity has always been top 4, top 5 issues that they come to me with or they come to coaching for. Um, and and that looks different for each individual. So for the gentleman who called me, December of last year, he had just come out of a relationship, and his question was, "Who am I now?" And he was very
Mm,
clear, like, I don't know who I am. I've been in this relationship. He'd been in a relationship previous to that, and he was like, "Who am I now?" And he was he was struggling to even answer that fundamental question of who am I without this person in my life, because I think for so many, and I don't think this is a gender issue. I think for people in general, but if we want to specifically talk about men, I think a lot of men identity becomes what I do.
yeah.
So I am an architect, or I am a this, or I am this, and I am successful. And he was very successful. I want to say he was 32 at the time, and he's a very successful businessman and owns multiple properties and this building portfolio and all these other things. And one would look at him externally and say, "Oh, he's successful." And
Right.
but his identity was so wrapped up in the things that he did. If those things go away, then who am I? So you need to be able to tell yourself and to describe to yourself first. That's what really matters. It's who am I? When I look in the mirror, who am I? And he couldn't do that. He couldn't really answer that definitively. He could kind of piece some things together, but it was all determined on something external to him. And when we were able to help him work through that, and we did a 6-month program, worked with him, and what I've seen from that point on, every guy that even in conversations, I had a guy call me last night. I never take phone calls on Sundays because that's family time for me. But there was something told me I needed to take this phone call, and I took the phone call, and it was a guy that I had talked with probably 18 months ago, and I said, "Hey, reach out when you feel like you're ready to get started." And he reached back out, and he was telling me some stuff. Every question he had was about who am I now? Everyone, every one of them. So I think, this is my opinion, but I think it's empirically, the evidence is there that for the most part, a lot of our identity, a lot of our struggle as men is around identity.
Wow. That's so interesting. I had this conversation. I just did a podcast last week, and for those listening, you'll be able to find it. But
Mm-hmm.
um, one thing they had mentioned, it was two guys that run a men's group, and they talked about the problem with men of wearing a mask,
Mm-hmm.
like um putting on like a putting on like a front to be something they think they need to be.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a big common theme. And it reminds me of this, where it's like my identity is what I do. Like I'm a carpenter, I'm a
Mhm.
successful business owner, I'm XYZ. But then when that's gone, who are you when that's all gone?
Yeah, when all that burns away, who are you? And those other things, the success, the accolades, all of those other things, those are just things that are great, but they don't define you.
Mm,
They don't make you who you are. You are who you are, but if you don't know who that is, then anything would work. So we can talk about, when we put that together, we couple that with vision. uh, we always use the analogy, because I live in the States here, on the East Coast, but I always tell people, if you want to go to LA, you don't head you don't get on, Interstate 95, which is a north south freeway, right? Because no matter what you do, you're never going to get to California. There is no direct route to California on a north south route, because it's an east west route. um, and I think that that's what a lot of people do. They think, oh, I'll do this because this is what culture says, church says, my parents say, and they go do that. They go to school, excuse me, they go to school, they get an education, and all of those things are great. But it's not what they want to do, because they hear the message of, oh, don't be an artist because art never pays your salary. Okay, then find something that really motivates you, find something that excites you, and then do art on the side. And then
yeah.
maybe that becomes, but if we identify as this or that or whatever it is, and those things go away, now we're lost. And I think we see that culturally.
Yeah.
I think we see that not just in the Western, I think we see that worldwide culturally in men. We are searching for identity. We are searching for something to ground us, which is why you get people like Andrew Tate and all of these other what do they call them? Apex men, apex males. I'm not even sure of the vocabulary, but
Yeah,
of
like
these apex,
alpha
alpha
males.
males and all this other stuff. And
Mm,
I'm just like, I don't want to be an apex, because apexes are alone. They're
mm,
solitary hunters. And that's what we think is the epitome of being a man. So we talk about conquest and all these other things and multiple sexual partners and all this other stuff. And
yeah.
this is not a religious argument, although I can talk about the religious side of it. For me, this is a soul care part. This is
Yeah.
a soul care issue. This is an identity issue. If I continue to give myself away to everybody else, then I have to put a mask on, which is what these two guys were talking about, because I don't know who I am. So I have to put on a facade. I have to put on a mask to say, oh, who do you need me to be? Because I don't know who I am yet. So I'm going to, and that starts back at 9, 10, 11. And how are we creating these young boys? What's the quote by, Frederick Douglass? It's easier to build strong boys than it is to repair broken men.
Yeah.
And right now, I think we're seeing the ramifications of, 20, 25, 30 years of really putting men in a bind identity wise. I think that that's what you're seeing culturally, which is, I think, the rise of, like I said, the hyper masculine and, you know, misogynists and all the other things. So that's just my opinion, but I think I'm right. Still my opinion.
Right. I'm curious your thoughts on this. Like, do you think that the process of figuring out who you really are as a man needs to be done with other men? And I'll give kind of like a little brief story for why. Um, Podcast I did recently, Ryan Carbondale, he shared this story of how he went to school in an all boys school in South Africa, and he shared how there was hierarchies and all this stuff. Like the seniors were the only ones that could go on the grass, but and there was all this like stuff, but he said it was an all boys school, and he was there for 4 years. And he said in those 4 years there was two fights. Now you might think like all boys school, testosterone, people be fighting, because fights happen.
Yeah.
But there was two fights, and he said without the presence of girls there, men act totally different, or boys act totally different, because there's nothing really to compete over. And then it was this whole kind of concept of putting a mask on, right? Because when the boys and girls come together, or men and women come together, it's like the dynamic changes completely,
Yes.
where the mask comes on, and then it's like, oh, I got to be successful, because then it's like
Mhm.
you're competing in this
Yeah.
area for, um, you know, for women or for men, right? And it's the same kind of thing both ways, but
Sure.
that I thought that was so interesting, and that was something I hadn't considered. Like I kind of considered men need each other, need to be around each other and stuff. But do you think men need each other to kind of figure out who they are? Like just being around other men?
Yeah, I think that there's definitely benefit to being alone. You know, I don't remember. I think it was Blaise Pascal said that there is no ailment known to humanity that wouldn't be cured by sitting 15 minutes in a room in silence. You
Yeah.
know, and we have become a frenetic culture, right? And so that frenetic pace limits our ability to find silence and contemplative places and meditative places. And I think that's to the detriment of our soul. So
Yeah.
there's definitely a place for the individual being alone, being silent, and maybe we would call it that monastic moment. But I think, and this is once again, I think it's borne out through multiple studies, and you can do Google search on it. But I think to be in a group of other men, and I would argue that it wasn't just the fact that it was just men in this, or boys in this school. I would argue it's because they created a culture of excellence. They created a culture of expectation. They created a culture of vision. And I think that the lack of that, in whatever context you want to put it, allows men to then say, I'm just going to do whatever I want to do. And being, hyper freedom, hyper individualistic, and hyper like, I'm going to live my truth. I'm going to do me. I don't care about anybody else. That can't happen in the context of this boarding school, this private school. Doesn't It doesn't mean that there wasn't individuality. And I would venture a guess that if we went back and we looked, that there would be those people that were just being themselves, right? So the group think is, or the group setting isn't. I don't want group think, that's the negative, but in the group setting, it's not that the person isn't allowed to be an individual. It's just that there's an expectation put on us externally to be this.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that what that does is it orders our priorities. And I think a disordered priority list. So the ordered priority list is, my guess is they have a creed of some kind that says this, and this are required. And I would say they probably have let's just say they, just as a round number, they have a list of 10. All 10 of those are related somehow to the person's or to the boy's character. We value honesty, no lying, no cheating. All of those are character things. So they're worried about character formation. So they
Yeah.
formed that boy's character. I don't have to compete with you because we're on the same journey together.
Mm-hmm.
Now we take it out of that context. There's no direction. I'm not saying there's no direction, but there's a limited amount of direction. And I
Mm-hmm.
just heard a statistic yesterday that, like, in America, like 70% of children in America now are growing up in a single, and don't quote me on the statistic. I'd have to go back and I can get the statistic for you. I can look at my notes, but there's a disordinate amount of single parent households
Yep.
with limited interaction by the father.
Yep.
And I think that that creates a whole slew of issues
Mm-hmm.
that if we take it back to the context of this boarding school, they didn't have that. Why? Because there was that hierarchy. There
Mm-hmm.
was that ranking of order. There
Mm-hmm.
was the seniors, juniors, freshmen, younger boys. And there was this expectation of me as a person. Well, that ties identity to vision because now I know where I'm going. And maybe it's a cliche, maybe it's trite, but I think it's a true statement that people perish for lack of vision.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that would be my thing, that I would go back to this gentleman at this boarding school, and I would ask specific questions about, you know, what were the expectations of you? What is this? What was this? What was this? And I think you could tie all of that back to the two prongs of identity and vision.
Mm. Right. Okay, well, let's talk about more about vision. How
Mhm.
how important do you think it is? We talked about um even with the lack of having a father and all
Mhm.
the struggles that come with that, but how important do you think it is for men in particular to have a vision and a mission and something like kind of a North Star they're aiming towards?
I think it's of the utmost importance, honestly. I think that if we just looked and I'm going to oversimplify for the sake of making this point. I realize that it's a complex issue. Um, the society we live on, there are multiple layers and multiple complexities, and so to simplify it down to just this or just that does a disservice to the everything else. But I believe, this is my belief, that when we see I just use me as an example of growing up without the influence of any positive role models, male role models at all, and none. I was raised by a single mom, and she did a great job. And I am the man I am today because my mom was a great mom, not perfect, but she was great, and she did the best she could with everything that she had. But I had no positive role models for about 7 or 8 years of my life. During the formative years from 6 to 14, I had no positive role models, male role models. What that did for me is it set up a chain reaction of wandering. Like there was no clear, distinct, like this is who you are. My name is Scott Holden, and I am this. I'm not a coach. I'm not a dad. I'm not a husband. I'm this. And I became a father. I am a husband. All of those other things, but those things don't define me, right? Well, the reason I can say that is because I know where I'm going. I have a clear North Star. I know what my purpose in life is. And I would just honestly, if we just were able to ask the question of just across the world to men and require them to be honest and require them to be authentic and forthright and vulnerable. What's your purpose in life? That's tied to vision. For me, it's directly tied to vision. What's your purpose in life? I would say probably more than 50% would not be able to answer that question. And so for me, it's of the utmost importance. You got to know who you are, and you got to know where you're going. You got to know what you're called to do, what your purpose is, there's always that tricky thing about, humans and purpose, all this other stuff. But I do believe we're called for a purpose. I think we're made for a purpose. We're not just random. I believe there's purpose I believe in creation. I believe there's a purpose to our order. So I believe it's of the utmost importance to have a clear vision and a clear mission and clear values. Our core values are what guide us. And those are the three things that we talk about is vision, mission, and values. And once we clear those up and once we have a really clear idea, it's amazing for us. Like I said, we've been doing this for 3 years now, almost four. 100% of the time, you create clear vision, clear mission, give clear values. Every couple we've worked with hundreds, every one of them has really come back and said, I never saw things like this before. I'm able to say yes to the things I really want to say yes to and no to the things that I would say yes to before, but they don't align with my vision.
Would you say that it is predominantly the father's role, like going back to your example of growing up with just your mom in those formative years? Would you say that it is the father's role to be the example of someone who has a mission and knows who they are and sets the standards, let's say, or sets the standards of the values? Would you say that that is the father's role? Or
Yeah, yeah, I would say that. I think there was a point in my life where I would have argued for kind of um, a flattened perspective, so not a male hierarchy, not a female hierarchy, but but as I've become a father and I've worked through my lack of a father figure in my own life, and as I've become a mentor to younger men, I see the importance of what a father gives. And this is in no way, like I said, I was raised by a single mom and she did a great job. But there's just certain things, and we just have to be honest now. And I think that in our culture today, we have a really hard time with this
yeah.
because I am in no way denigrating or degrading single moms, because I would argue that it's the lack of the ability of the man. Not always.
Hmm.
Once again, it's the complexity of this issue, right?
Yeah.
But a lot of men know how to be they know how to be a dad, which means I've just inseminated my female partner, my wife, my girlfriend, or whatever. I've made her pregnant, but I'm not a father.
Hmm.
Because a father for me in general, and I think across the board for men that are doing this work with other men, father connotes a whole other level of expectation and experience. Because anybody can be a dad because it just takes sperm, right? But not everybody can be a father because that connotes a very holistic view of my humanity, my woundings, my failures, my successes, all of those things put together in a pot, brought together so that I can come out and I can be the best version of myself. So that I can show my sons, I apologize for my lighting here, so that I can show my sons, this is what it means to love your mom, my women. They're going to find that out by how I love my wife. We're not perfect. Of course not. But when I kiss my wife and my boys go, ooh, yeah, that's showing them something. Now they don't necessarily like it right now, but they're not always going to be 4 and 11. You know, they're going to be 16, 17 and hormones are excited and they're going to notice things differently and they're going to know how to treat a woman because not because of what I've said, although that's important, but because of what I've done. Because I cuddle my wife, I hold her hand, I do all of those things. Now that's just the relationship piece. The how do I deal with anger piece? How do I talk about what do you want to do with your life? You know, my 4-year-old wants to be, one day he wants to be an astronaut, the next day he wants to be a painter, the next day. Well, let's just be realistic. You can't be everything, and I think that that's part of the problem is you can be whatever you want. Well, that's not true. because I was never going to be a basketball player ever. And the reason is because I have about a 6-inch vertical leap. I mean, I literally cannot jump. I never worked on it. I probably, if I would have, I'd have been better. So to tell me at 7, 8, 9, you can be a basketball player, probably not going to happen. One and another, I don't like basketball, right? I don't like to play it. I like to watch it. But I want to engender in him the idea that there's a lot of things that he can do. But that's the vision piece. So what do you want to be when you grow up? I think is a legitimate question for them, because what the father does is to help them to create clear boundaries. So we talk about vision, mission, values, purpose, and boundaries in our coaching program. And a clear boundary, I'm not saying that a single mother kid couldn't do this, but there's something inherent in the relationship between a father and a son, a father and a daughter, that I believe, however you want to narrate it, it doesn't matter to me, but I believe that there is something that happens in the relationship between a father and their son and a father and their daughter that that when that doesn't happen, it creates a hole. And then you're trying for the rest of your life to fill that hole. So I think I do think there's something that happens that only a father can give.
I think fathers are like the disciplinarians. Like
Mm-hmm.
they they set the boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of generally speaking, like mothers are like the unconditional love, and then
Mm-hmm.
fathers are kind of like
Yeah.
the almost like the show you love by showing you how to navigate life, like the
Mm-hmm.
tough um, realities of life,
Mm-hmm.
helping you through it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I don't disagree with that. I think that's a really great way to put it. There was I'm going to butcher the quote, um, but there was a famous writer theologian named A.W. Tozer, and he said that your view of God will determine your view of yourself and your actions after. This basically is what he was saying. That's not the exact quote, but that's the Scott Holden paraphrase. And I think that what we see is what the father does is it creates a view. Once again, this is where my Christianity is going to come out. I realize that not everybody holds my beliefs, and that's okay. And you don't have to be a Christian to work with me, so I'm good with that. But I'm always gonna be me, and I believe that I show my sons an imperfect view, of course, because I'm not perfect, of who God is as their father.
Mm.
And so my goal would be to show them that I'm present, that I'm there, that I listen, that I'm forgiving, that I'm just, that I'm all these other things. Because I think that if we looked honestly, our view of God was set by our interaction with our father. So if our father was abusive, then we're most likely going to see God as abusive. If
Right.
our father was distant, then we're most likely going to see our father as distant. If our father was absent, we are most likely going to see God as absent, unless there's intervention, of course. And there's always room for redemption and intervention. And this goes back to your question about do men need a group? Yes, this is why, because they have to see empirical evidence that it's not just me who has this issue.
Yeah.
It's not just me who hates their dad or feels lonely or abandoned or isolated or abused, but
Yeah.
there are in this room 30 other men who are sharing their stories, because vulnerability is the key. And this is where you can't get alone. You don't get vulnerability by yourself. You get vulnerability in a group. And vulnerability is a superpower. It's a 4-letter word for some, but it's truly a superpower. That's why we need a group. And
Right.
that's where the father comes in. The father helps us to create that strength internally to say yes to things and no to things,
Mm,
whether we call it self-esteem, self-worth, whatever. I think the father is fundamentally key to that.
right. It's just unfortunate that it's so common for
Mm-hmm.
um, single parent homes. Um, and then that whole thing, and I'm sure people are familiar with, well, maybe not. Um, most teachers are women,
Mm-hmm.
and childcare. So like kids end up being kind of like overmothered and underfathered,
Mm-hmm.
which is unfortunate.
Agreed. Yeah, it is unfortunate, and once again, no judgment. It is what it is.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where we as men need to step into that gap. We need to step into that place.
Yeah.
Um, and if we don't know how, what do I do? I think that's where you see the prevalence of these groups of men getting together, whatever. I shared with her earlier when we were off camera. I benefited from an organization that I worked with, and I've gone to 2 of their retreats. Um, and it's like, 2.5 days of, intense soul work. I came
Yeah.
out of there knowing something else about myself every time, but every time I was actually able to reconcile that part of my past, which I believe has therefore made me a better father, a better husband, a better friend, a better coach, just a better person. Once again, back to the group setting.
Oh, right. Okay. I want to talk about purpose and your I think this is a big subject for a lot of men. Like you mentioned, like maybe 50% or more of men couldn't say like exactly what their purpose is, or may not know what it is
Mhm.
at all. How would men go about, like, in your opinion, what's the best way to go about finding your purpose? If there's guys listening to this that want to start, like, how do you find your purpose? How do you find why you're here, or what what's that reason that you have that you're alive, and
Yeah,
what's the thing you want to share with the world?
yeah, man, that's great. That's great. There was a great movie. I can't remember the name of it right now. On Disney Plus. So for those of you who have Disney Plus, I could look up the title, but um, it was about a jazz musician, and he dies, goes to heaven or goes to the afterlife. I don't think they call it heaven, and he kind of cheats the system and gets off the grand staircase to the eternal world, and he goes to the intermediary world, right? And then he tries to get back to earth and get back to his body because he believes that his purpose is to be a jazz musician, because that's what he always wanted. There's this really great line, and I'll get you the the title, because I think there's some insights in that movie that I think any man would benefit from watching it. But there's this one part where they're in the kind of the intermediary world, and the guy says, I got to get back for my purpose, and the spiritual being says, oh, you humans and your purposes, right? There's no such thing as a grand purpose. Well, I don't believe that. I do believe there's a grand purpose, and I think that one of the ways we get there is just simple questions. So purpose is directly tied to vision, right? If for at least it is for us, it Project Its Wings. And I think in general, I don't think you can separate the two.
Yep.
So there's questions that you can ask. We have a worksheet that we help people work through to create, to find their core values, to help, find their vision, to help to define it, to write it out, to define their mission, find it, write it out. And I think as they start to put those things together, they start to say, oh, well, this is what I do. So for me, I had a life changing encounter with Jesus when I was 14 years old. It was running track. It was literally right before a track meet, and the positive role model that I told you I didn't have for years, he became this positive role model for me. He was my track coach, Coach C, and he literally comes up before the track, literally before my race, a minute, 2-3 minutes before my race, and he says, "It's time." Now, we'd been having a conversation for a year, and he says, and I said, "It is." And I in that moment, I surrendered my life, and I had a life changing encounter, and it truly changed the trajectory of my life. Now, I believed in that moment that I wanted to be a pastor, because that's what everybody told me. I grew up in the Catholic Church, and my grandmother, God rest her soul, I'm pretty sure she prayed every day that I would become a priest. And much to her dismay, at 12, I told her I loved girls. I didn't think priesthood was in it for me, because my priest at the time said, "You do realize that it is a life of celibacy." And I asked him what that was, and he said, "No women." I said, "Yep, I'm out," you know. But now I had this encounter, and I'm like, oh, now I can do what I feel like I'm called to do, what my purpose is. And so for the rest of probably the next 20 years, I pursued this purpose. I went to school for it. I trained for it. I read books for it. Much to the chagrin of my wife, when we moved here to Maryland from Colorado, I brought all of my books, and I have a library. I mean, if you remember the Beauty and the Beast, that's my library. I have like thousands of books, you know. And she's like, "You don't need all these. You're never going to read them again." I go, "I might," you know, kind of thing. I have a hard time letting go of books for some reason. But I pursued what I thought was my purpose. But then I started asking myself questions. And one of the fundamental questions I had asked, it was just really simple: is this all there is? And that began really an unpacking of, it can be your purpose. So maybe your purpose is to, so I will just say me, my purpose is to help people create a life that's thriving. I believe that's my purpose. Now, that's really broad, right? So how does that become narrowed down? That's the vision, the mission, the values piece. So for me, how do I help people create a life that's thriving? I mentor men and women, young men and women. My wife and I do relationship coaching. I do coaching men, and I'm in the process right now of creating a group that's going to launch in January of 2024, end of January. It's going to be a 6-month program. We're getting ready to launch that. We're working on the name and all the other stuff right now. So my purpose, I thought, was to be a pastor. Well, maybe that is my purpose, but I can work that calling, that purpose out in multiple places. So I'm always a pastor. I'm always a shepherd. I'm always a teacher. That's just part of my makeup. But I don't have to be in a church to do that. Mm-hmm. I can work that purpose out in so many other places. So people are, we do an assessment in our coaching program. We talk a lot about, there's one thing that talks about them being caregiver. Mm-hmm. And predominantly those people are, you know, nurses, psychiatrists, doctors, you know, whatever. Yeah. Did an assessment for a guy, and he's a police officer. He's like, "Well, I don't like that." But I said, "But you serve and you help and you," so all of the things that you would see in this limited category of nurses, doctors, psychiatrists, you do that as a police officer. You are of service. So his calling, he felt like, I just wanted to serve. I wanted to be there. But he also had a high protector. So he was really a high protector. He had a really high frequency in that sense. So for him, it was, he just was going to be a police officer. And that's what he did. And he is fulfilled. And he believes he's fulfilling his purpose to be of service and to protect. And so I think that there's fundamental questions that we ask. Like, what do you enjoy doing?
I don't mean to interrupt, Scott.
No,
Is
go
that
ahead.
like is that a personality test that you do with your clients to like identify certain traits?
It's called an attitudinal assessment. And so a personality assessment is looking for specific things, and an attitudinal assessment, and it's broad ranging, and it's just, and generally we tend to think of those things as fixed, right? So if
Yeah.
you take the Myers-Briggs or the DISC or whatever, you're always those things. This is a snapshot in time. So it's dealing with how you deal with life under stress, and also how you show up when you're at an optimal level. And there's 7 ranges of what we call energy that you'll look at. And one of those levels of energy is a servant and a helper, and and then another one is just very much of a protector and all this other stuff. And so if this guy was to take this test a year from now, those answers would look different, but the core of who he is would still come out. Now it may come out a little differently, because we all are changing. We're all evolving, right?
Mm.
We're all growing. Whether you think you are or not, you're either going forward or you're going backward. There's no neutral. And I want to help people go forward, which is why I do what I do. So I realized I was on staff at a church. It didn't work out. I got fired on Good Friday, because I was immature, because I was doing things. I was undermining. I'll be fully transparent there. I was immature. I got fired, and rightly so. But because I had tied my identity to being a pastor so tight, and I held onto that so tightly, right?
Yeah.
Well, now I'm not a pastor. Who am I? And for the next 15 years, I worked out, oh, I don't have to be in a church to operate these in my gifts, to operate in my talents, to operate in my purpose and calling. And then everything I did was oriented towards creating an avenue for me to work those things out. Now, to anybody's listening to this, you can do this. What are your values? What are the 3 things that you just non-negotiables, undeniable? These are what you stand for. Ours are hospitality, courage, and resilience. Those are our core values for our family. Everything comes from that. So if there's something that we need to do, we're going to act courageously, but we're always going to be hospitable. You can't see it right now, but my desk is the kitchen table. So everything in our house happens in the kitchen. Everything in our house happens around the kitchen table, or the dining room table, but most of the kitchen table. How do we begin to engender and create an avenue for the Holden family to live out a life of hospitality? You come to our house, you're going to get fed no matter what. You're here for 5 minutes. Hey, are you hungry? That's just, for us, that's who we are. I think this, once again, I'm going to say this a lot, but I think it's backed up by empirical evidence. For the average person listening, for anybody listening to this, I am not unique. The multimillionaire, the billionaire, whatever, who has a clear idea of who they are and where they want to go and everything else, they are not unique. The ability to have a clearly defined, distinct purpose, to have clear vision, clear mission, clear values is not for some and not for others. It's for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
It's work. You got to work at it. But if you want to become great, if you want to work in excellence, if you want to walk in excellence, and if you want to walk in your purpose, you got to start with vision, mission, and values. Once you get there, then you can start to ask specific questions like, what are the things that I like? What are the things that I enjoy? What are the things that give me peace? What are the things that bring true happiness? Not temporal happiness, not this happiness is tied to this outcome. Whether that outcome happens or not, I'm filled with joy. I'm happy.
Mm-hmm.
Now we can start to see, oh, I really like helping people succeed. Okay, now what are the professions? What are the things that you can do to live that out daily? Well, I'm a CPA. Okay. Does it float your boat? I like it. I like doing it. Okay, great. How do you now take that value of wanting to help people, which maybe you think that's your purpose? Maybe you feel like deep down inside your purpose is to help people to create wealth. How do you do that as a CPA? Maybe you put together classes, maybe. So we're looking for a monolithic idea of, this is my purpose. This is my calling. It's textured, it's complex, and it's contextual. So in one context, my purpose is worked out like this. So when I'm coaching, it's here. But when I'm coaching my 11-year-old's soccer team, that purpose looks different. And it should, because an 11-year-old isn't the 35-year-old man who's struggling with identity. The 11-year-old wants to score as many goals as possible. So the onus is on me to show that 11-year-old it's great to score, but it's better to be a great teammate. So what does it look like there? So it's always contextual, always. I hope that made sense.
Oh, 100% it does. Oh, I think that's really good. Like, it sounds like it's more of a direction rather than attachment to one thing. Like, you have your values set and who you are, what you um what you want to do, or how you want to interact with the world, whether it's like I want to help people or I want to do whatever it is in a certain way, and then that's your guiding light, and then that's how you interact with like all of your life,
Mm-hmm.
like whether you're
Yeah.
coaching your 11-year-old or you're, you know, but that, I think that's very helpful, because then it's like, okay, this road goes this way, but it's not like I'm super attached to being a pastor or I'm super
Mm-hmm.
attached to being a carpenter. It's like, no, I like working with my hands and I want to build things. Well, there's a lot of different things you can build, but
Yep.
that's like the road you're on, right? I think that's
Yep.
very helpful, because then that gives you just a framework. Because I think, like how we mentioned, we get so attached to identity.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm gonna take a step back. I think that it's okay
Mm-hmm.
if that's the starting point.
Yeah.
We're all there at some level. We become attached to things. We become attached to the outcome. We become attached to that, and so there's no judgment there. But we have to realize that I can't stay there,
Yeah.
because for one, that's unsustainable.
Mm-hmm.
It's not sustainable at all, because those things will flee. The company will shut down.
Yeah.
Okay, the car will break down.
Yeah.
Your body, you know, I'm not in. I'm in pretty good shape for a 56-year-old. I try to take as good a care of myself as I can,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm not the same man I was at 30.
Yeah.
Right? I've got a little extra pounds. Got a little more gray hair, although I was gray at 30. Um, so things change. So I can't be attached to who I was at 30. That's when you get the guy who graduates from high school and at 40 is still living that game in high school. That's the only thing that they have going for them,
Yeah.
because that's their identity.
Yeah.
They don't know how to let go of that. And so everything they've built is around this. So
Yeah.
their purpose is tied to this memory. And our brains are meaning creating machines. So the meaning of his life was tied to this success.
Yeah.
But there's so much more to our lives. Like, I'm not, and God forbid, and I don't wish this on anybody, but if my wife and sons died, I would be deeply saddened and heartbroken, right? It doesn't change the fact that I'm a father and a husband. That's still there. Even though they're not here anymore, I would still be a father and a husband. The context changes now. And I think we crave certainty, not fidelity. And certainty locks me in place. Well, if they're not here, I'm not a father. I'm not a
Mm-hmm.
husband. No, I'm always going to be her husband, even though she's not here. The context has changed. So now I have to, what does it look like to be faithful in this context? When she's not here, I'm still married. She's downstairs in her office working right now. I don't see her, but I'm still married to her. That doesn't change. And I think for a lot of us, we have this idea that I have to be able to hold it in my hands. I have to be able to see it. Well, that's in fact the antithesis of vision.
Mm. Yeah. Right.
Vision
Right.
is saying, this is where I'm going. I know it's there, but now I have to create it. Sometimes I truly have to create it. And that's where identity comes in, because I have to be the person who sustains this. I have to be the person who creates this, you know? Well, how do I do that? Well, what are my values? What's my vision? What's my mission? You know? And if I have a clear idea of the future that I want to create, there's a lot of research out now on future self, and there's some great books that I recommend for my coaching clients to read and all this other stuff. But there's this whole idea of letting my future self talk to my present self. You know, so what is the Scott 5 years from now want to create? Well, who do I need to be that? Who do I need to be to do that? Because the Scott of today isn't the Scott that is going to be sustaining that stuff 5 years from now. Because there's a lot of stuff about me that needs to change. And maybe it's just 1% here, 1% there, but I can't carry on with the things that I do now, because probably 80% of those things aren't going to serve the person that I'm becoming. So I need to create new patterns, new beliefs, new structures, you know, new systems, because the systems that are sustaining me now, as I'm growing this coaching program, as I'm scaling this coaching program, aren't going to be the ones I need when I'm scaled, when I'm growing, when I'm, you know, it, it's just, you know, and that's purpose piece. That's the vision piece. That's the mission piece.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you for coming on and sharing, Scott, sharing what
Yeah,
you're
you're
doing and
welcome.
sharing
You're
all
welcome.
this knowledge. I think it will be helpful for men. I mean, this everything you're talking about, those three pieces. I think men need to hear it. I think men are searching for it. I think it's
I,
missing.
I I agree. I think it's missing, and I think, once again, not to make this about religion, because I think we can strip away the religion piece of it, and I think it's a universal. Luke 15 talks about the parable of we call it the parable of the prodigal son, right? And technically, it's really the prodigal of the loving father. The son is the secondary character. The father is the primary character. And the son squanders his possessions. He squanders his wealth. He does all this other stuff. And the father is waiting. The father's there. And in the end of the story, at least towards the end of the story, the son comes back, and he's not really repentant. He just, circumstances are what they are. He's like, I need to eat. You know, it's like my dad. I can go back to my dad. That's what he kind of. But the dad isn't the dad. The dad becomes the father. And he says, my son who is dead is now alive. And he puts shoes on his feet, a ring on his finger, and a robe on his back. All of those things are identity pieces. Okay. Now, that's an irreligious story. That is the story of humanity. We are all seeking to be reconciled to something greater than us, whether that's our earthly father, whether that's a male role model, or whatever. And we have to realize that it starts with us realizing that I cannot do this on my own. I cannot re-engineer my past, my present, and my future alone. And I think that that's the fundamental shift that you're going to start to see in the next 5 to 10 years. And that's why I'm so passionate about what we do here at Project Roots and Wings.
That's awesome, man. Um, where can people find your stuff if they want to reach out, potentially work with you, or they want to find more information? Where can they find you?
You can email me at scott@projectrootsandwings.com. That's probably the easiest way. And then my website is projectrootsandwings.com. I'm in the process of reworking it, because it was, when we created the website, it was predominantly for relationship coaching, and now, of course, we've branched out, and so we're doing a rebranding. We're doing a rebuild. So if you go there, there's contact information. You can send me a contact. You can go to work with me page. I think it's called work with me page, or contact us, and you can fill out the form, and then that'll be sent to me, and go with that. But those are the two best ways. Email Scott at Project Roots and Wings. You can also find me on Instagram at Scott_A_Holden, or Project Roots and Wings. Those are my Instagram handles. You can DM me there, email me, all of that stuff. Those are the best ways to get in touch with me.
Okay. I'll put that in the description as well for anyone listening.
Excellent.
So it's easy for you to find. Um, Thank you again for coming on, Scott, and sharing
Oh
this
my
stuff.
gosh, my pleasure. My pleasure. I'm glad this happened. I know we were struggling with illness and COVID and everything else that's going on for the last couple of weeks, but man, I woke up this morning. I was really excited about this conversation, and if you can't tell, I'm really excited about helping people create lives that are thriving, and I'm super passionate about helping men, get in contact with their purpose and their vision.
That was beautiful, man. I can tell that you're definitely helping men. So I
Yeah,
appreciate you
cool.
coming on.
Appreciate it.
All right. We'll see you there.
All right. Thanks, man.